The weight of a hand. Korran Vale had killed 11 people with his hands, and not one of them had ever been touched by him first. That was the order the Threll had always understood violence to move in. Weapons at a distance, blades in the middle range, and hands reserved for the end of things. For the single blow a warrior owed an opponent too broken to finish the fight themselves. A mercy strike, the last contact two bodies would ever share, delivered close enough to feel the other's final breath leave them. Among his people, a hand laid on another person meant exactly one thing, and it was never comfort. So when the small, soft-boned human woman stepped off the transport at Meridian Station and extended her open palm toward him in greeting, Korran did not know, for one genuinely disorienting second, whether he was being challenged. "Mira Solano," she said when he didn't take it, lowering her hand without any visible offense, just mild recalibration, like someone adjusting for a language gap rather than an insult. "Cultural liaison, you must be my detail." "Korran Vale," he said. "Security escort." He did not explain what her offered hand had almost cost her in the half-second before his training caught up with his instincts. He filed it instead, the way he filed everything about this posting. An item in a long private inventory of ways this assignment was going to be beneath him. He had not asked for Meridian Station. 6 months earlier, he had been a line officer in the Threll Compact's border defense. A posting with weight and purpose, and then a formal reprimand he still considered unjust, had reassigned him to guard a human aid at a joint diplomatic outpost so far from anything resembling real conflict that the station's greatest recorded threat in the past year had been a coolant leak. Everyone he'd served with understood exactly what this posting was. A demotion wearing a title. The reprimand, if he was honest with himself in the private hours no one else had access to, had come from a decision he still didn't fully regret. A border skirmish gone wrong. A wounded enemy scout too injured to fight and too valuable to simply end, and Korran had made the call to bring the man in alive over the objection of two more senior officers, who considered a live prisoner an unnecessary risk not worth the resources to manage. He'd been right, tactically. The intelligence the scout eventually gave up had saved a border outpost from a second, larger assault 3 weeks later. Being right hadn't mattered. What had mattered in the closed-door review that followed was that Korran Vale had hesitated at the exact moment Threll doctrine expected finality, and doctrine, once questioned, tended to remove the soldier who'd questioned it rather than examine itself. He hadn't understood, standing in that review room accepting a reassignment dressed up as routine rotation, that the instinct they'd punished him for was the same one that would eventually save him. He wouldn't understand it for months yet. He intended to serve out Meridian Station with minimum engagement and maximum professionalism. He did not intend, in his very first hour on duty, to watch a grown woman hug a baggage clerk she had met 4 minutes earlier. Field log. Korran Vale, Meridian Station, Day 1. Subject exhibits touch behavior inconsistent with any threat assessment or mating display pattern in Threll protocol. Physical contact appears unrelated to hierarchy, combat readiness, or reproductive signaling. Subject touched, 1 baggage clerk, embrace, 4 seconds, 1 junior translator, hand on shoulder, extended, 1 child belonging to a kestrel trade delegate, hand placed on head, brief. No apparent purpose to any of the above. Recommend continued observation. Recommend separately that command explain what I did to deserve this posting. Sirs. It did not stop at the baggage clerk. Over the following weeks, Korran catalogued Mira Solano's physical habits the way he might have catalogued an unfamiliar weapon system, methodically, with growing unease at how little of it made sense within any framework he possessed. She touched people to greet them, to comfort them, to punctuate laughter, to steady someone who'd stumbled, to say goodbye. She touched people who were strangers to her and people she'd known for years with what appeared to be exactly the same casual, undifferentiated warmth, as though touch cost her nothing and she saw no reason to ration it. He kept his distance from all of it, professionally and otherwise. When her posture demanded he stand close during station transits, a security necessity, nothing more, he angled his body precisely enough to make contact statistically improbable. She noticed. He was fairly sure. She never mentioned it. That too went into the log, filed under a category he didn't have a name for yet. Things this human does that I do not understand and have decided not to ask about. He told himself the distance was professional discipline. He did not examine closely enough to have to admit it, that some smaller and more stubborn part of him flinched every time her hand came anywhere near him, the way a body flinches from an old wound, whether or not the current threat is real. The bombing came on an ordinary Tuesday, in the way violence on quiet postings always seemed to arrive without the decency of warning. A coalition calling itself the Unbound Compact, 3 fringe worlds who'd opposed the Confederacy's expansion since before Meridian Station had a name, furious at what they considered an endless parade of species trading away sovereignty for a treaty seat, had decided the diplomatic outpost made an acceptable target for a message they wanted the wider galaxy to hear. Korran felt the detonation before he heard it, a pressure change through the station's lower promenade, half a second ahead of the sound, and every year of border defense training he'd spent the last 6 months resenting fired at once, cleanly, without hesitation. He had Mira on the ground and his body across hers before the second charge went off, plating absorbing debris that would have opened her skull, his weight pressing her down into the scorched decking hard enough to bruise. When the shaking stopped, she didn't move for a long moment. Neither did he. Then her hand found his. Not the deliberate, diplomatic greeting from the landing bay. Nothing performed about it at all. Just fingers locking around his wrist with a grip that had nothing left in it but raw animal need to hold on to something solid. "You're bleeding," she said into the ringing quiet, and it took him a moment to understand she meant him, not herself, that some part of her attention in the immediate aftermath of nearly dying had gone to the injury on his shoulder instead of her own, considerably worse ones. He didn't answer. He was too occupied with the fact that her hand hadn't let go of his wrist, and that some deep old part of him, the part that understood touch only as violence or its aftermath, was waiting, with genuine confusion, for the blow that was supposed to come next. It didn't come. She just held on, breathing hard, until the medical team reached them, and when they finally pulled her away to a stretcher, she reached back for one more second and squeezed his hand once before letting go entirely. He stood in the wreckage of the promenade a long time after that, staring at his own hand like it belonged to someone else. Field log, Korran Vale, Meridian Station, Day 90. Subject sustained minor injuries in the unbound compact attack. During the incident, subject initiated physical contact with escort, myself, under conditions of extreme distress. Contact was not combative. Contact appeared to serve a regulatory function. For the subject, and against every prior assumption I have held about my own physiology, apparently also for me, I do not have a category for this. I am going to need one. Not everyone on the station's security detail found his change in bearing worth ignoring. Sergeant Yorin Cass, a broad, scarred veteran of the same border campaigns Korran had come up through, had made his opinion of the posting clear from the first week, and made it clearer still in the days after the bombing, when word of the promenade incident worked its way through the Threll contingent, the way rumors always did among soldiers, with too much downtime and too few real threats to occupy them. "You let her put her hands on you," Cass said in the mess hall, not quite loud enough to be a formal accusation, but plenty loud enough to be heard by the 2 junior officers at the next table. In front of the whole detail, a Threll soldier, groomed for contact by a human civilian like a pet being trained to heal. She was in shock, Korran said, keeping his voice level. I was bleeding. Neither of us was thinking about protocol. That's not what I saw in the incident footage. Cass leaned back, arms crossed over a chest plated thick enough to have shrugged off worse than a bombing. I saw a soldier who didn't pull away. Twice. There's a word for what we do to soldiers who stop pulling away, Vale. You know it as well as I do. Korran did know it. Soft, not spoken often because it didn't need to be. A single syllable that carried a soldier's entire worth downward the moment it was applied. The same word his own father had used once, about a cousin who'd wept openly at a funeral instead of standing the expected silent vigil. Korran had believed it himself once, wholly and without question. He found turning it over now in a mess hall 4 months into an assignment that was supposed to have broken him, that he no longer knew if he believed it at all, only that he still flinched from hearing it applied to him, the old shape of the shame still fitting even as the conviction behind it had started, quietly, to come loose. He didn't argue with Cass that day. He simply finished his meal and went back to his post, and told himself the sergeant's opinion carried no real weight. It took him longer than he wanted to admit to notice that he was still thinking about it hours later, the way an old wound aches worse right before the weather changes. She found him 3 days later in the station's underdeck maintenance corridor, off-duty and off the record, doing the kind of solitary weapons drills Threll soldiers did when they needed their bodies to stop thinking for a while. You've been avoiding me since the attack, she said, not accusing, just stating it the way she seemed to state most things, plainly, without the diplomatic padding her actual job apparently required of her everywhere else. I have been performing my duties, Korran said, from 4 extra feet away than you used to. She sat down on an equipment crate uninvited and didn't seem inclined to leave until she got an answer. I don't need you to explain yourself, Korran. I just don't want you thinking you did something wrong. You saved my life. If I made that weird for you afterward, I'd rather know. He set the training blade down. There was, he understood slowly, no professional posture that got him out of this conversation, and some tired, worn-down part of him no longer entirely wanted one. Among my people, he said, touch is a currency with exactly one denomination. We do not embrace, we do not hold hands. A hand laid on another Threll means the fight is over and someone is about to die, either the enemy or a soldier too injured for the field, granted a mercy strike by whoever is closest to them when the injury becomes unsurvivable. He looked at his own palm, still faintly discolored from where the promenade's wreckage had cut it. My brother died that way, in a blood debt duel, mandated by a dispute neither of us started, delivered by an opponent who did him the courtesy of ending it clean instead of letting him bleed out slow. That is the last time contact meant anything to me. It has meant that, and only that, since I was young enough that I don't fully remember a version of myself before it did. Mira didn't say anything for a while. She didn't reach for him either, which he understood, distantly, as its own kind of consideration. "I'm sorry," she finally said. "About your brother." She was quiet for a moment, turning something over before she decided to say it. "My mother left when I was 6. Not dead, just gone one day. No explanation good enough for a 6-year-old to hold on to. My grandmother raised me after that, and she wasn't a talker, never had the words for a lot of what she felt, and neither did I, most of the time. But she'd put a hand on the back of my neck whenever I was scared, or grieving, or just having a bad day at school, and somehow that said all of it anyway. I'm here, you're not alone, I'm not going anywhere. I grew up believing that was just what a hand was for, the thing you do when the words run out." She looked at him, something rawer than diplomacy in her expression now. "I'm sorry I've been putting my hands on people here like it doesn't cost anything this whole time, without knowing what it actually meant where you're from. Where I'm from, it's the opposite of an ending. It's the thing you reach for so somebody doesn't have to be alone with whatever's happening to them." She stood, brushing dust off her uniform. "I'm not going to stop touching people, Korran. It's not performance for me. It's the only inheritance my grandmother left me that I actually know how to use, but I can stop doing it to you if that's what you need. You just have to tell me." He didn't answer immediately. He found, when he tried to, that he wasn't entirely sure what the honest answer was. "I don't know yet," he finally admitted, which was, for a Threll soldier 6 months into a posting he still resented, as close to an emotional confession as anything he'd said aloud in years. "Okay," she said simply, and left it at that. She didn't push, and for the first time since the landing bay, he found himself slightly disappointed that she hadn't. The weeks after that conversation moved differently, in ways so small he almost missed them accumulating. Mira didn't touch him, but she started asking, in small, unremarkable moments, a hand half raised before a decision, a pause at his shoulder before deciding not to close the distance. And something about the asking itself began working on him in a way that touch never could have on its own. It was the first time in his adult life anyone had treated contact as something with his consent built into it, rather than something that simply happened to a body when circumstances demanded it. He started noticing other things too, once he stopped spending all his attention guarding against her. The way she touched grief differently than she touched joy. Gentler, slower, more deliberate, as though comfort required a different grammar than celebration. The way the station's junior staff, homesick and far from their own worlds, visibly steadied whenever she put a hand on their shoulder during a hard shift. The way a held breath releases. He began to understand, slowly and against every instinct his upbringing had built in him, that what he'd spent weeks cataloguing as inexplicable behavior was in fact a language, one with real grammar, real precision, real cost, and real reward, that he had simply never been taught to read. The night the message came from her homeworld, he was standing his usual post outside her quarters when he heard something through the door that didn't sound like any of the sounds he'd catalogued from her before. Quieter, rawer. He didn't need to understand human physiology to recognize grief when he heard it. He knocked, which wasn't strictly protocol, and she opened the door with her face wet and unguarded, in a way she'd never once let him see her. "My grandmother," she said before he could ask, her voice cracking around the words. "Back on Earth. She raised me, mostly. I wasn't there." She wrapped her arms around herself, visibly trying and failing to hold something together that had already come apart. I don't actually know what I need right now. I'm sorry. You don't have to stay." He should have left. Every protocol he'd been trained under said comfort duty wasn't part of a security escort's mandate, and every instinct from home said he had no framework for whatever was about to happen in that room. He stayed anyway. He didn't know what to do with his hands, standing in the doorway of a grieving woman's quarters, so he did the only thing he could think to do. He sat down on the floor across from her, not touching, just present, the way he'd have stood vigil over a fallen soldier's body before the war had trained that instinct into something colder. And somewhere in the middle of the night, without either of them quite deciding it should happen, her hand found his on the floor between them. Not the desperate grip from the promenade, something slower, steadier, an anchor rather than an emergency, and he let it stay there and understood, watching her cry in a language of grief he still barely spoke, that this too was something Threll culture had simply never given him a word for. Comfort that asked nothing back. Presence as its own complete purpose. He didn't pull away. That, more than anything before it, felt like the actual turning point. Not the moment she touched him, but the moment he chose, fully awake and fully himself, not to flinch from it. Field log, Korran Vale, Meridian Station, day 61. I am no longer certain this is a field log. I have stopped writing it for command. I am not sure who I am writing it for anymore. Entry stands regardless. Humans appear to use touch as a form of language, capable of carrying meanings my own culture reserves for entirely separate and considerably more limited forms of communication. I do not yet have the vocabulary to translate it fully. I intend to keep trying. The Unbound Compact came back 4 months into his posting, and this time they came prepared, with an extraction team rather than explosives. A snatch operation aimed squarely at Mira, whose diplomatic work brokering resettlement terms for 3 border worlds had made her, in the Coalition's calculus, worth considerably more alive and leveraged than dead in a bombing nobody claimed credit for. Korran took the first attacker down before the man's boots fully cleared the service hatch he'd breached, a strike delivered with the same clean efficiency he'd trained his whole life toward. The second came at him from an angle he hadn't fully covered, a miscalculation he'd have court-martialed a junior officer for 6 months ago and had no time now to forgive himself for, and the blade meant for Mira's escort found the gap in his side plating instead, deep enough that he felt the wrongness of it before the pain caught up to announce itself properly. Somewhere behind him he heard Sergeant Cass's voice over the comm, already 3 corridors out and closing, shouting for backup in a tone that had none of the mess hall's contempt left in it at all. Just the flat, focused urgency of a soldier, realizing a comrade might not survive the next 60 seconds. He didn't have 60 seconds to spare on the thought. He couldn't afford to go down, not with a third attacker already moving on Mira, who'd frozen for exactly the half-second panic demanded before her training. Brief, civilian, nowhere near enough for this, kicked back in, and she scrambled for the emergency beacon on the wall behind her. What happened next was the thing Korran would spend a long time afterward trying to understand about himself. The third attacker went down easily enough beneath him, disarmed, pinned, entirely within Korran's power to finish the way 11 Threll engagements before this one had always ended. A hand laid against a defeated opponent. The mercy strike his whole culture had taught him was the only meaningful use for contact between 2 bodies. Cass's voice was still closing on the comm, close enough now that Korran could hear the man's boots pounding the deck, plating 2 corridors out, close enough that whatever Korran chose to do next would happen in full view of the one soldier on this station who'd called him soft to his face for it. He didn't do it. He looked down at a man who was beaten, not dying, capable of interrogation and information, and, however distantly, some kind of future beyond this corridor, and understood, with a clarity that arrived faster than he expected it to, that the old grammar didn't fit this moment at all. Mercy, he realized, the real kind, the kind Mira had been quietly teaching him without ever once calling it a lesson, wasn't always the blow that ended something cleanly. Sometimes it was the restraint not to. He held the man down instead, disarmed and breathing, until station security arrived, Cass first among them, skidding to a stop in the corridor entrance, taking in the scene in a single sweeping glance. A pinned and living prisoner, a wounded escort still holding position instead of finishing the job doctrine demanded of him. Cass didn't say anything. For once, Korran thought, watching the sergeant's expression shift through something that wasn't quite comprehension yet, but had stopped being contempt. He didn't need to. Only once the rest of the security detail took the prisoner off his hands did the blood loss finally catch up with Korran all at once, dropping him hard against the corridor wall with his vision already narrowing at the edges. Mira reached him before the medics did. She didn't hesitate this time, didn't ask, didn't wait for permission he was in no state to grant or withhold. She simply took his hand in both of hers, pressing it hard against her chest the way you hold something you refuse to let finish slipping away, and stayed exactly like that, talking to him in a low, unbroken stream of words he only half caught until the medical team pulled her back to work. He woke in the station infirmary 2 days later to find her asleep in the chair beside his bed, still in the same uniform from the corridor, her hand resting loosely against the edge of his where it lay on the medical bunk, not gripping anymore, just there, the way you leave a hand near something you intend to still be holding when you wake up properly. He didn't move for a long time, watching her sleep, turning over the strange new weight of everything the past 4 months had rearranged in him. Then, carefully, deliberately, for the first time in his adult life, choosing contact rather than merely enduring or receiving it, He closed the small remaining distance and folded his hand fully around hers. She woke at the movement, blinking, disoriented, and then understanding arrived on her face all at once, soft and unguarded. "Hey," she said, voice rough with sleep. "There you are." "I disarmed him," Korran said, which wasn't the first thing he'd meant to say, but was apparently the thing that needed saying first. "The third attacker. I had every justification, every precedent from my own people to finish it the way I was trained to. I chose not to." He looked at their joined hands, still faintly disbelieving of his own choice to have made this one. "I don't know what that makes me. Among my own people, I think it might make me something they don't have a category for yet." "It makes you someone who learned something," Mira said, "instead of someone who just survived something. That's rarer than people think in any species." Word of what happened in the corridor reached the Threll Compact's regional envoy faster than Korran expected, carried by station security reports that made careful clinical note of an unusual restraint shown by the security escort during a hostile engagement. The envoy, a hard, decorated veteran named Sask Orivan, who'd known Korran's father before the border war took him, requested a formal debrief. "You had a clean mercy strike available," Orivan said, reviewing the incident footage with an expression Korran couldn't fully read. "You chose to withhold it. Explain your reasoning, soldier." Korran considered for a moment, offering the kind of tactical justification his training would have accepted without argument. A prisoner has intelligence value. A live hostile is a bargaining asset. Any of the cold calculus that would have closed the conversation cleanly. He found, when it came to it, that he didn't want to. "I've spent 4 months guarding a woman who taught me, without ever intending to teach me anything, that contact between two people doesn't have to end something to mean something," he said. "I used to believe a hand only had one honest use. I don't believe that anymore. I think that was always a smaller idea of strength than the one I actually needed." He met Orivan's gaze without flinching from it. "I withheld the strike because for the first time in my life, I understood there was a stronger choice available than the one I was trained to make." Orivan was quiet for a long moment, studying him with the particular scrutiny of a man recalculating an assessment he'd walked in already certain of. "Your father would not have understood that answer," Orivan finally said. "No," Korran agreed. "I don't think he would have." "I'm not certain I fully do either." Orivan closed the file. "But I watched the footage twice before this meeting, soldier, and I will tell you what I told your commanding officer an hour ago. Whatever this posting did to you, it did not weaken you. You held a line under fire, sustained a wound that should have taken you off your feet, and still made a decision more disciplined than anything I've seen from a line officer in a decade. I don't fully understand what changed in you out here." He stood, extending a hand, an actual hand, in the old Threll fashion, an offer of a mercy strike between equals, the closest thing his own culture had to respect freely given. "But I'd be a fool not to recognize it as growth instead of damage." Korran looked at the offered hand for a long moment. Then, for the first time in longer than he could remember, he reached out and took it. Not as an ending, not as a mercy strike, but as something his own people had never quite had a word for until he'd learned, 4 months late and far from home, to build one himself. He requested permanent reassignment to Meridian Station 8 days later. The request was approved without argument, which surprised him less than the relief he felt reading the confirmation. He found Mira on the promenade that evening, rebuilt now, the scorch marks from the first attack finally sanded away, replaced with the ordinary bustle of a station that had learned, twice now, to keep functioning after violence tried to make it stop. A small human child, a refugee from one of the resettlement worlds Mira's work had spent months negotiating terms for, sat alone near the observation window, clutching a bag with everything she owned in it, too frightened and too far from home to approach anyone at all. Korran watched Mira cross to the girl without hesitation, crouching to her height, offering a hand the girl could take or refuse entirely on her own terms. The girl took it. Mira didn't say anything grand. She just held the small hand in hers, steady and warm, until some of the fear visibly loosened out of the child's shoulders. Korran crossed the promenade and crouched down on the girl's other side. He was not, by nature or by training, built for this kind of gentleness. He had spent 30 years of his life believing a hand only carried one honest meaning. He held his own hand out anyway, palm open, offered rather than demanded, exactly the way it had first been offered to him on a landing bay 4 months and 1 entire lifetime ago. The girl looked at him for a long moment, an alien, plated and scarred, kneeling at her level with an open hand, And then, slowly, she took it. Korran Vale, who had once believed a hand only meant an ending, understood, holding a frightened child's hand steady on a rebuilt promenade, beside the woman who had taught him otherwise, that he had finally found the second meaning. It had been there the entire time, in a language he simply hadn't been taught to read. He was still learning it. He suspected, watching Mira smile at him over the child's bowed head, that he would be learning it for the rest of his life, and for the first time in longer than he could remember. That didn't feel like a demotion at all. Field log, Korran Vale, Meridian Station, day 187. Discontinuing this log, command never read it past the first month, and I stopped writing it for command, somewhere around the second. I am filing one final entry regardless, because a soldier should know his own record. Subject, myself. Observation. I used to believe a hand carried exactly one honest meaning, and that I understood the whole of it by the time I was young enough that grief still felt like the only teacher worth trusting. I was wrong about the number. There are at least two. I have spent 6 months learning the second one from a woman who never once tried to teach it to me on purpose, and from a sergeant who called me soft, and then stood in a corridor doorway and said nothing at all when soft turned out to be the stronger choice. I do not know how many more meanings a hand actually holds. I intend to spend considerably longer than 6 months finding out. Entry ends, Korran Vale, Meridian Station. If you enjoyed this video, press the like button, subscribe to the channel to help it grow, and leave a comment.